The heavy rain pattered relentlessly against the windows of Eric's new home, a quaint, somewhat dilapidated Victorian mansion he had bought at an absurdly low price at auction. The house, known among locals as their Crimson Keep, had a checkered past that contributed to its notoriety and, evidently, its value. Eric, a budding horror novelist, saw this as a boon, a perfect atmosphere for inspiration. He had set up his workspace in what seemed like an innocuous room on the ground floor, overlooking the garden now shrouded in mist. As he unpacked, his eyes often wandered to a small, wooden door in the corner of the room, slightly ajar, leading to the basement. The real estate agent had casually mentioned it was best left unexplored due to safety concerns. Naturally, this piqued Eric's interest more than it deterred him. One evening, as the clock struck midnight, Eric sat typing away when a sudden cold draft swept through the room. He noticed the basement door slowly creaking open. Pausing his work, he walked over and peered down into the darkness. The air felt unnaturally cold, sending a shiver up his spine. "Probably just the wind," he muttered, closing the door firmly and returning to his desk. However, the peace was short-lived. Over the next few days, odd noises emerged from below, the sound of something, or someone, dragging and occasional whispers that seemed to echo through the vents. Eric's curiosity turned into an obsession. He needed to find out what was hidden beneath the floors of his new home. Armed with a flashlight and a recorder to document his findings for a potential book, Eric finally decided to venture down. The basement was vast, much larger than he had anticipated, filled with relics of the past, old furniture covered in dust sheets, boxes of yellowed books, and antique mirrors stained with age. As he ventured deeper, the temperature dropped further, and the air grew thick with the smell of damp and decay. In the far corner of the basement, Eric stumbled upon a peculiar setup, an old wooden desk with a vintage typewriter, stacks of paper beside it as if someone had been working there recently. The papers were filled with frantic scribbles, stories of ghostly apparitions and demonic encounters. Each story ended abruptly, as though the writer had been ripped away in the middle of their tale. As Eric shuffled through the papers, the whispers returned, louder this time, swirling around him in the darkness. A cold hand seemed to brush against his back. Whirling around, flashlight darting from corner to corner, he found nothing but the oppressive darkness. He hurried back to the desk and grabbed the typewriter, determined to take it upstairs. But as he lifted it, the basement was plunged into darkness. The flashlight flickered out, leaving Eric in pitch black. Panic surged as the whispers morphed into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, desperate, angry, pleading. The air around him vibrated with the intensity of the unseen crowd. Eric, overwhelmed with fear, stumbled blindly towards the stairs, the voices crescendoing into a deafening roar. Reaching the safety of the ground floor, Eric slammed the basement door shut, heart pounding in his chest. He leaned against the door, catching his breath, the voices silenced by the thick wood. As his breathing slowed, a realization dawned upon him: the stories on those papers, they weren't just stories. They were experiences, warnings perhaps, written by those who had dared to uncover the secrets of the Crimson Keep before him. With the typewriter now in his room, Eric felt an inexplicable urge to write. He set it up, inserting a fresh sheet of paper, his fingers poised above the keys. But he hesitated, a sense of dread washing over him. What if writing on this typewriter was an invitation, a call to whatever haunted the basement? Shaking off the fear, Eric began to type, documenting his encounter. As he typed, the atmosphere in the room shifted, the air cooling, the edges of his vision darkening. The whispers returned, faint but unmistakable, seeping through the floorboards. Eric paused, his last sentence hanging unfinished as he listened to the sounds. The realization that the stories might not just be bound to the basement, but could be part of the entire house began to dawn on him. And perhaps, he thought with a shudder, they were now part of him too. The typewriter keys clacked softly by themselves, continuing the story Eric had hesitated to finish. As the typewriter keys clacked away, Eric watched in frozen horror, the hairs on his neck standing upright. The machine seemed to take on a life of its own, the keys tapping rhythmically, crafting sentences with eerie precision. The air grew colder, and a faint, ghostly light emanated from the paper, illuminating words that seemed to bleed onto the page as if the ink was fresh blood. Eric's fear escalated as he read the words forming on the page, "Not alone, never alone." The simple phrase repeated over and over, each repetition more forceful than the last. A feeling of dread settled deep within him, the sensation of unseen eyes watching from every shadowed corner of the room. He wanted to run, to escape the house and its malevolent presence, but a perverse curiosity rooted him to the spot. Determined to confront whatever forces were at play, Eric decided to explore further into the history of the Crimson Keep. The local library in the sleepy town had a section dedicated to regional history, including a well-documented lineage of the house's previous owners. The librarian, an elderly woman with a knowing look, cautioned him as he checked out the materials. "Be careful, young man," she said, her voice a whisper, "some stones are best left unturned." Ignoring her warning, Eric spent hours poring over old newspapers and journals. He learned that the house had been built in the late 1800s by a reclusive author known for his macabre and supernatural stories. Each successive owner had met with strange and often tragic ends. A pattern emerged: every owner had been consumed by an obsession with the supernatural, each trying to uncover or utilize the house's dark energies, and each leaving a trail of chaos in their wake. Equipped with this knowledge, Eric returned to the house as nightfall enveloped the world in darkness. The air was thick with the impending storm, the wind howling like the cries of the damned. As he stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind him, as if the house itself was sealing him in. The whispers began almost immediately, louder than before, and this time accompanied by soft, eerie laughter. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and contorting into grotesque figures. Eric felt a pull towards the basement, the heart of the house's darkness. Compelled by a force beyond his understanding, he found himself standing before the basement door, hand on the knob, hesitating. Taking a deep breath, he opened the door and descended into the abyss. The darkness was oppressive, suffocating, as if swallowing him whole. His flashlight flickered, casting long, sinister shadows that seemed to writhe and twist around him. The air was filled with the scent of decay and something far worse, a smell of ancient, forgotten death. As he reached the bottom of the stairs, the door above slammed shut. Panic gripped Eric, his heart racing, his breath shallow. He shined his flashlight around, revealing more of the room than he had seen before. In the farthest corner, obscured by shadows, stood a large, old mirror, its surface cloudy and obscured by age. As Eric approached, the air grew colder, and the whispers louder, urging him closer. He stood before the mirror, his reflection barely visible in the cloudy glass. Then, slowly, the surface began to clear, revealing not his own reflection, but a series of horrifying images. Scenes of past tragedies played out in the glass, people twisted in agony, their screams silent but palpable, their fate sealed within this cursed house. Each reflection was more terrifying than the last, each story etched in pain and horror. Suddenly, the images stopped, and in the glass, Eric saw his own reflection again, but he was not alone. Behind him stood a figure, shrouded in darkness, its eyes glowing a faint, malevolent red. Eric spun around, but there was nothing there, only the oppressive darkness of the basement. Whispers turned to shouts, the disembodied voices angry and insistent. "Write the stories," they commanded, "tell of our pain, our rage, our vengeance." Eric realized that the typewriter, the papers, the stories, they were all mediums for these trapped souls, desperate to communicate, to be heard, to be avenged. Terrified yet compelled, Eric ran upstairs to the typewriter. As he sat down, the air around him grew heavy, the feeling of sadness and anger palpable. He began to type, not by choice, but by necessity, driven by the unseen forces that guided his hands. The keys moved swiftly, telling tales of horror, each story a testament to the house's dark history. As he wrote, the storm outside grew more fierce, the wind screaming like the voices of the damned, the house creaking and groaning as if in pain. Eric knew he could not stop, not yet. The stories needed to be told. The spirits at the oppressive atmosphere of the house seemed to thicken with each word Eric typed, the air charged with an electric tension that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. The typewriter keys continued their relentless dance, the clacks echoing in the eerie silence between the howls of the wind outside. The room flickered with shadows that moved independently of any light source, as if the darkness itself was alive and writhing. Eric's fingers trembled, but he couldn't stop. The stories pouring from him detailed the lives and tragic endings of those who had once dwelled within these walls. Each character felt disturbingly real, their despair palpable, their cries for release from their eternal torment a chorus of anguish that resonated deep within his soul. As he delved deeper into the heart of the house's history, a pattern began to emerge. It wasn't just the physical structure of the house that harbored darkness, but something far more sinister, an ancient curse, born from a pact made with a shadowy figure whose name was never spoken, only hinted at in hushed, fearful whispers. This entity promised inspiration and knowledge at a terrible price, the soul and sanity of those who dared to seek its secrets. Hours slipped into what felt like minutes as Eric typed, lost in a world of spectral horrors. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the house, snapping him out of his trance. He jerked his head up, listening. It came from the basement. The air grew colder, a sign that whatever resided below was not pleased with the stories being brought to light. Eric stood, his legs stiff and sore. He felt drawn to the basement once more, a morbid pull that he couldn't resist. He grabbed his flashlight, its beam flickering uncertainly as he made his way to the door. As he opened it, the familiar chill greeted him, wrapping around his body like a cold embrace. Descending the stairs, each step creaked under his weight, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Reaching the bottom, he turned the flashlight around the room, the light cutting through the darkness like a knife. His beam landed on the old mirror, which now stood ominously quiet. He approached it, his reflection pale and ghostly in the dim light. As he watched, his reflection began to distort, twisting into a visage of horror. The eyes sunk deep into the skull, the skin pale and drawn tight. But it wasn't his face anymore, it was a mask of fear, reflective of the house's tormented souls. The mirror seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the air around it vibrating with the screams of the damned. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The whispers started again, louder this time, a cacophony of voices that filled the basement. They seemed to emanate from the mirror itself, the words intelligible, yet filled with such desperate emotion that they didn't need to be understood to be felt. "Free us," they seemed to say, a simple plea repeated over and over. Eric backed away from the mirror, the flashlight's beam trembling in his unsteady hand. He turned to leave, but his path was blocked by shadows that moved against the logic of light. They swirled around him, their forms ambiguous, shifting between human and something else, something darker. He tried to push through, but the shadows felt thick, almost solid, resisting his movements. Panic surged within him as he realized he was trapped. The air grew suffocating, the whispers turning into screams that echoed off the walls of the basement, filling the space with dread. Fighting against the overwhelming fear, Eric struggled through the shadows, each step harder than the last. As he finally reached the stairs, a force pulled at him from behind, tugging him back towards the mirror. He stumbled, catching himself just before he could fall. Climbing the stairs, the screams followed him, a haunting soundtrack to his frantic escape. He slammed the basement door shut, leaning against it, his body shaking from exertion and terror. Their house was quiet now, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Eric knew he couldn't leave, not yet. The stories were still incomplete, the spirits unrested. Whatever secrets the house held, whatever curse it bore, he was now a part of it. The typewriter, the mirror, the basement, they were all pieces of a puzzle that he had unwittingly become a part of. As he stood in the silence, the typewriter began to clack again upstairs, its keys moving of their own accord, calling him back to continue the tales of horror. With a heavy heart, Eric ascended the stairs, each step creaking under the weight of his dread. The stories were not done with him, and he was not done with them. The house had more secrets to tell, and he was the vessel through which they demanded to be heard. Eric's footsteps echoed ominously as he returned to his makeshift workspace where the typewriter sat, an old, mechanical predator awaiting its prey. With each step closer, the air seemed to thicken, charged with a palpable tension as if the house itself was alive, its breath cold and damp against his skin. The typewriter was clacking away as he entered, the keys hammering down with unnerving ferocity. The paper was filling up with words, sentences forming without his input, telling tales of horror that seemed to draw from the deepest fears of the human psyche. Eric watched, transfixed, as the machine spun tales of torment and madness, its ribbon striking the paper like a lash upon the skin of reality itself. Drawn unwillingly to the chair, Eric sat down, his hands hovering over the keys that moved of their own accord. He felt a cold presence envelop him, a spectral force guiding his hands, pressing his fingers down onto the keys. It was as though the spirits trapped within the walls of the Crimson Keep were channeling their stories through him, desperate for their tales to be told, for their voices to be heard. The room around him dimmed, the only light emanating from the eerie glow of the typewriter itself, casting ghostly shadows on the walls. The air was filled with the sounds of the past, faint cries, the rustle of old fabric, the whispers of those long gone, discussing their fates in hushed, urgent tones. Each story Eric typed was more horrific than the last, tales of betrayal, loss, and unimaginable pain, each one ending in tragedy and despair. As he typed, the room seemed to warp and change. The walls stretched and groaned, the very fabric of the house contorting as if in pain. Pictures on the walls flickered between their mundane appearances and grotesque versions of themselves, their subjects' eyes following Eric with silent accusation. The boundaries between the past and the present blurred as the house relived its tormented history. Outside, the storm raged with renewed vigor, thunder crashing as lightning illuminated the house in brief, stark flashes. In those fleeting moments of light, Eric thought he saw figures standing outside the windows, their faces pale and distorted with grief and rage, pressing in as if to escape from the horrors within. Amidst the chaos, a new story began to form on the paper, one that chilled Eric to his core. It was his own story, not the one he had lived, but one he was destined to live. The narrative foretold of his descent into madness, driven by the voices of the house, the endless typing, the relentless haunting of his every waking moment. It told of his isolation, as friends and family turned away, fearing what he had become. It spoke of a darkness that would consume him, leaving nothing but another shadow wandering the halls of the Crimson Keep. Fearing for his sanity, Eric tried to rise, to break away from the typewriter, but his hands were not his own. They continued to type, compelled by a force far stronger than his will. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and the voices louder, drowning out his thoughts, filling his mind with their anguish and despair. Desperate, Eric screamed, a roar, guttural sound that tore at his throat. He screamed for release, for silence, for anything but the relentless noise that filled the house. And for a moment, the typing stopped, the room fell silent, and he felt a fleeting sense of relief. But it was short-lived. From the silence emerged a single, clear voice, different from the others, calm, cold, and commanding. "Write," it said, resonating within the core of his being. "Write and do not stop, for your story is the key to our release." With a sense of inevitability, Eric found himself drawn back to the keys, his hands moving once more to type his own fate. The house settled around him, the atmosphere thick with anticipation, as if the building itself was waiting, watching, alive with the stories of the past, intertwining with his own. As he typed, the barrier between his mind and the spirits thinned, their emotions bleeding into his, their memories becoming his visions. The horrors of the house were no longer just stories, they were experiences, lived and felt in the depths of his soul. And so he wrote, the typewriter an extension of himself, the ribbon staining each page with the darkness of the house's history. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, both without end, both without hope, driving him deeper into the labyrinth of horror that was the Crimson Keep. As the night deepened, the tempest outside mirrored the chaos within the Crimson Keep. Each flash of lightning illuminated the grotesque dance of shadows across the walls, their twisted shapes merging with the Victorian decor to form a macabre tableau. Eric's fingers flew over the typewriter keys, driven by a force he could neither comprehend nor resist. The room grew colder with each word typed, the chill seeping into his bones like the icy fingers of death. The oppressive atmosphere weighed heavily on him, a palpable presence that seemed to feed on his fear. Despite the cold, sweat beaded on his forehead, each droplet a testament to the terror that gripped his heart. Outside, the wind howled like a chorus of the damned, its mournful cries echoing through the halls of the ancient house. The windows rattled in their frames, the glass warping as if to scream in agony. With each gust, the house itself seemed to moan, a deep, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards and into Eric's very soul. The stories that poured forth from the typewriter grew increasingly sinister, reflecting the dark history of the house and its many tormented inhabitants. Tales of madness, of unspeakable acts committed in the throes of despair, of spirits condemned to relive their horrors eternally. Each character seemed to reach out from the page, their ghostly fingers clawing at his mind, desperate for release from their eternal prison. As he wrote, Eric felt his own sanity fraying at the edges, the boundaries between himself and the characters in his stories blurring until he was no longer sure where they ended and he began. Their fears became his, their pain echoed in his chest, a sharp, constant ache that would not abate. In a brief moment of clarity amid the chaos, Eric realized that the typewriter was no mere conduit for the tales of the past, it was a key, a tool meant to unlock something dark and powerful trapped within the walls of the Crimson Keep. Each story added to the tapestry of spells woven into the fabric of the house, each word a chant that brought them closer to completion. Driven by a desperate need to understand, Eric paused in his typing, his eyes scanning the rapidly filling pages. His gaze caught on a pattern repeated throughout the texts, a series of cryptic symbols that seemed to pulse with an unholy light. The symbols were not merely decorative, they were part of the incantation, part of the ritual that tied the spirits to the house. With trembling hands, Eric traced the symbols on the page, his fingers moving of their own accord. As he did so, a gust of wind slammed into the house, stronger than any before. The windows shattered, sending glass flying like shrapnel as the storm's fury invaded the interior. Eric ducked, shielding his head with his arms as the wind howled through the room, the voices of the damned loud in his ears. When he looked up, the room had changed. The walls were closer, the ceiling lower, as if the house itself had contracted around him. The air was thick with the stench of decay and old blood, the floorboards sticky with a substance too dark to be anything but sinister. Eric stood, his legs unsteady, and made his way to the window, or where the window had once been. Now there was only an open void, a gaping moor that revealed the storm in all its terrifying glory. Lightning illuminated the garden, now a wild tangle of overgrown plants and twisted trees, their branches gnarled like the fingers of witches. As he watched, figures began to emerge from the shadows of the garden, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They moved towards the house, their steps slow and deliberate, their eyes hollow pits of despair. Eric stepped back, his mind reeling with fear and confusion. These were the characters from his stories, made flesh and blood by the power of the house. They were coming for him, drawn to the creator of their torment. Fleeing back to the typewriter, Eric realized that the only way to survive the night was to continue writing, to finish the story that had begun over a century ago. His hands flew over the keys, the clacking a desperate counterpoint to the storm's roar. With each word, the figures drew closer, their whispers growing louder. They were in the house now, their presence a chilling certainty. Eric could hear their ragged breathing, feel their cold gazes upon his back. But he could not stop, could not turn to face them. He had to write, to finish the ritual before it consumed him. And so he typed, the words a lifeline in the growing darkness, his only hope for salvation or damnation. The story unfolded, a narrative of darkness and light, of redemption and despair. And as he reached the climax, the house itself seemed to pause, holding its breath as it awaited the final word. As Eric hammered away at the typewriter, the encroaching spirits grew denser, their forms more distinct and menacing. The air around him crackled with the energy of the unquiet dead, each keystroke echoing like thunder through the corridors of the Crimson Keep. His mind raced as he tried to weave a conclusion that would satisfy the tormented souls, not just to end their haunting but to save himself from becoming one of them. The characters, now nearly tangible in their ghostly forms, circled around him, a gallery of despair and torment. Their faces, twisted in eternal agony, flickered in the dim light, illuminated intermittently by the fierce lightning outside. Each flash revealed more of the horror that filled his room, their eyes hollow yet burning with an intense, desperate hope. Eric's fingers trembled, but his resolve strengthened. He understood what he must do. The story he typed now was not just a tale of horror but a binding spell, a sealing of the pact that had been broken and misused by those who had come before him. He wove his words carefully, infusing each sentence with a plea for peace and redemption, for closure not just for the spirits but for the house itself. As he neared the end of his manuscript, a powerful gust of wind swept through the room, scattering the pages of his previous writings. The spirits seemed to stir, agitated, as if they could sense the impending conclusion of their centuries-old ordeal. The temperature dropped so drastically that each breath Eric took felt like inhaling ice. His hands were numb, yet he typed with relentless urgency. Let this house forget the darkness it has seen, Eric typed, his words a whisper of hope amidst the cacophony of the storm and the spectral murmurs. Let these souls find their rest, and let the Crimson Keep be no longer a keep of pain, but a haven of peace. The typewriter's clacking grew louder, almost deafening, as if the machine itself was resisting the end of its purpose. Eric's heart pounded in his chest, his body slick with a cold sweat as he typed the final words. Just as he struck the last period, a blinding flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a thunderclap that shook the foundations of the house. Silence fell, a heavy, tangible silence that filled the room like a physical presence. The oppressive atmosphere lifted as if a great weight had been removed from the house and from Eric's shoulders. He looked around, panting, his chest heaving with exertion and relief. The spirits, those tortured figures that had surrounded him, began to fade, their forms dissolving into the air, their faces finally showing traces of peace and release. As the last of the spirits vanished, the house itself seemed to sigh, a sound of release and renewal. The walls brightened, the shadows receding like a bad memory fading with the light of dawn. The storm outside abated, the winds calming and the relentless rain softening to a gentle drizzle. Eric stood from the typewriter, his legs shaky but his heart filled with an exhausted triumph. He walked to where the window once stood, now just an open frame allowing the fresh, cleansed air of the night to enter. He breathed deeply, the air sweet and cool, no longer filled with the stench of decay and despair. Looking out over the garden, where the twisted trees now stood serene under the caress of the night breeze, Eric felt a profound connection to the house. He had not only uncovered its darkest secrets, but had also played a part in its redemption. Yet, as he turned back to the room, his gaze fell upon the typewriter, still sitting on the table, innocently inert yet somehow foreboding. He knew the stories were not all told, the secrets not all revealed. The typewriter had more tales to give, and he more to write. But for now, the Crimson Keep was quiet, its horror momentarily at bay. The conclusion of this night's tale was merely a pause, a breath taken in the long narrative of the house. As he contemplated this, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the darkness, casting long, golden fingers into the room. Eric knew that with the new day, new shadows might emerge, but for the moment, there was peace. And in that peace, he would rest, gathering his strength for whatever tales were yet to come. As dawn's light washed over the Crimson Keep, Eric felt a temporary respite. The night's horrors had receded, giving way to a deceptive peace that hung in the air like the aftermath of a storm. Yet the typewriter sat ominously silent, a relic of torment that had unleashed untold horrors the night before. Eric knew that peace in this house might just be the eye of the storm, a brief pause before the darkness gathered strength again. Throughout the day, Eric roamed the now quiet halls of the Crimson Keep, his mind replaying the events of the night. The walls, once oppressive with shadows and whispers, now seemed almost benign under the touch of sunlight. But the atmosphere was charged with a latent tension, like a held breath waiting to be released. Eric could not shake the feeling that the house was alive, watching, its malevolent presence merely lurking, gathering force. As evening approached, the air grew chill, and the house seemed to subtly shift, the earlier peace giving way to a creeping dread that slithered through the corridors like a silent fog. Eric returned to his room, where the typewriter awaited, its presence more menacing than any ghost. The sun's last light faded, and with it, the brief spell of calm. That night, as darkness enveloped the house, Eric sat before the typewriter once again, compelled by a force he could neither deny nor understand. The air crackled with the eerie electricity of unseen eyes upon him. He placed his fingers on the keys, the cold metal biting into his skin, and began to type, not out of desire, but necessity. The spirits may have found their peace, but the keeper of stories remains bound, he typed, the words appearing almost against his will. For the Crimson Keep holds more than the memories of the past, it holds the essence of the pact made in shadows, a covenant of darkness and light. As he wrote, the air around him thickened, the darkness deepening, drawing in around him like a cloak. The wind began to howl once more, a mournful, angry wail that seemed to echo through the corridors with the sound of 1,000 lost souls. The house trembled, a low, menacing rumble that threatened to shake the very foundations. Eric's heart raced as he typed the final words of his tale, the story of the house itself, of its birth from darkness and its yearning for light. Let this final tale be the seal and the release, the end of the old covenant and the beginning of a new legacy. As he struck the last key, a profound silence descended upon the room. The typewriter ceased its mechanical dance, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted as if a great weight had been lifted from the house. A faint light began to glow within the room, emanating not from any lamp or candle, but from the typewriter itself. It grew in intensity, a soft, golden light that filled the space with warmth and an inexplicable sense of peace. Eric stepped back, watching in awe as the light intensified, spilling out into the hallways, casting away shadows, purifying the air with its brilliance. The house itself seemed to sigh, a sound of release and renewal, as the light touched every corner, every hidden nook, cleansing it of the darkness that had lingered for so long. As the light reached its zenith, the walls of the house began to shimmer, the very fabric of the building seeming to dissolve into the light. Eric shielded his eyes, the brilliance overwhelming. When he finally dared to look again, he found himself standing not in the confines of the Crimson Keep, but in an open field, the house gone, as if it had never been. Stunned, Eric turned in a circle, the reality of what had happened slowly sinking in. The Crimson Keep, with all its horrors and histories, had been released, the final story told, the covenant fulfilled. All that remained was the typewriter, sitting benignly on the grass where the house once stood, its purpose served, its stories ended. Eric approached the machine, a sense of reverence in his steps. He laid a hand upon it, the metal cool and somehow soothing under his touch. "Thank you," he whispered, not sure to whom he spoke, to the house, to the spirits, or perhaps to the typewriter itself. With a last look at the open field bathed in the soft light of dawn, Eric walked away, the weight of the past lifted from his shoulders. The Crimson Keep was no more, its stories complete, its spirits at rest. And while the future was uncertain, one thing was clear: the tale of the Crimson Keep would live on, a haunting memory of a house that was both a prison and a sanctuary, a place of horror and of healing.